Thanks very much for joining us for this afternoon panel on refugees and migrants in northern Africa. We will not have presentations, but I will rather be asking our panelists questions and briefly introduce them in that process too. We will very broadly speaking, have two rounds of questions, one focusing really on what happens to people on the way to Libya. So if you wanted to look at it geographically in a way, what happens to people before they reach the Libyan border? What actions are being taken to support them? And the second round will be focusing more specifically on Libya, but also to an extent on Tunisia and Morocco and the situation there. And the idea really being that should leave us with plenty of time for your questions and also for our online questions, of which I hope we will get many. So there should be more than enough time for that. My name is Florian Westphal. I'm the Director General of MSF Germany, and in a way, arguably having somebody from MSF as a panelist, or sorry, as a moderator, so rather as a role of a sort of neutral intermediary on this question is maybe a little bit of an adventure and a bit far-fetched, because I'm not going to deny that MSF and I myself also have some fairly strong opinions on this subject, but I'm going to try and do my best and rather let the others speak. We have an excellent panel here to do that and to give us different perspectives, which is very important. Before I ask the first question, I just wanted to read something to you, which I found on a website recently launched by an Italian NGO, Doctors for Human Rights, who interviewed about 2,400 people over a period of 3 years who made their way across the Sahara and mostly across Libya into Italy. And there's a quote attributed to somebody simply called by their initials CA from Senegal, 27 years old, interviewed in 2015 in Sicily. Our driver stopped in the middle of the desert and went away, leaving 34 of us there with no food and water. Some of us started walking away. They never came back. They must have died there. Most of us remained next to the vehicle for 3 days. I saw 8 of us dying there because of dehydration and lack of food. We ended up drinking the perfume we had with us and our urine. After 3 days, a vehicle came and picked us up. Based on that horrific testimony, I want to ask Monica Goracci of IOM first. You work with people who have crossed the Sahara. You also work with refugees and migrants before they actually go on this crossing. What are you hearing about their experiences? What are they telling you about their journeys? And actually, interestingly enough, also, how do they literally go about embarking on this journey?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting IOM to this Congress. First of all, I would like to say that we are in front of a very complex situation. We used some time ago, I think based on a definition of about 15 years ago, where we were talking about mixed flows, when we had migrants and asylum seekers at the time. We prefer to talk now about complex flows, because we don't have only those two categories. We have very vulnerable migrants, we have victims of trafficking, we have victims of smuggling that have all sorts of abuse, we have unaccompanied minors. The latest was the arrival of this boat in Italy, which they called the children's boat, with 240 children, out of which 178 unaccompanied minors. In a boat of 600 is really huge. So it is changing, and we cannot pretend that the concept of the protection of refugees is applied to all these categories, but new protection mechanisms need to be found. And we hope that this is a message that will come across and new solutions will be found. IOM is active in all of the Northern African countries, and I was going to focus maybe mostly on Niger, because there we have 5 reception centers that have a capacity of about 1,600 people, and that is where we see most of the migrants transiting. We have profiled approximately 5,500 migrants in 2017. Most of them in Agadez and Arlit, in these two centers. They are 61% is in the age range of 18 to 30. Education level is half is secondary, 20% primary, and 11% higher. The reasons why they are transiting is 70% seeking employment, and about almost 20% fleeing poverty. They finance their migration trip mostly with their own funds, and in a few cases borrowed from friends and families. And 60% of the interviewed migrants report at least one incident of abuse. Of the abuses reported, the most common incidents are threats, in about 30% of the cases, confiscation of money or identity document, and physical violence. We had several women telling our colleagues in the field that they got married en route because they preferred to be abused by one man 10 times rather than 10 times by 10 different men, which is very common among the testimonies that we receive from the women. The main countries of stay before the return process are Niger and Libya. Yeah, okay, because it's going. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so these are the statistics of the migrants we have been profiling in Niger.
Stefan, in many ways I would like to ask you to simply sort of build on that same question a little bit and share with us the experience you've been seeing in your projects. I think you mentioned a number of activities and programs across the West Africa region, right?
Yeah. Hello. Just maybe to come back on the context. So the Sahel region, so Niger and all Burkina Faso, Chad, has a long habit on migration. There is a lot of internal migration within those countries. It's just because there is no work during, there is one season of farming, and so then people are working, and then after that they migrate mostly in the coastal countries, which is Benin, Ivory Coast, and Libya was also one spot just to make a survival during the 6 months period between the farming works. It's important because it means that Niger, for example, or Burkina Faso, they really know what migration means. In some region of Niger, when you go to the dry season, there is no men there. It's only women and children. The men are already migrate somewhere, Benin, Ivory Coast, or Libya. And so after that, they come back. They come back to the family and working on the field, and it's a kind of a seasonal migration system. And that's a part of the survival system of those regions. Then what's happened now in Niger, in Agadez? So there was a big amount volume in 2016. So we speak about in Agadez, which I don't know where, if you situate well Agadez, it's the middle of the desert. It's the main town between Niamey, which is the capital, and the road to Libya or the road to Algeria. There is two roads. Oh yeah. Great. And Agadez, it's a town of 70,000 people. It's not very large. It was really touristic at one moment. It lost a little bit the attraction after several conflicts in the area. It's also an element of the economy because now the migration road and the migration economy, it's the part of the survival system of the population there in Agadez. So it's an important source of money. In 2016, there was more or less 300,000 refugees who were crossing in Agadez. In 2017, for the moment, we count only 30,000. What happened? Migrants disappear? No, in fact, they didn't disappear. There was a big change in policy. So Niger is a little bit the good student of European Union. They decide to think, in fact, controlling the border a little bit more with EU money, and also make a law to make human trafficking illegal, which was not the case before. So now what's happened in Niger around Agadez is that the migration road is much more informal than before, and people are not stopping in Agadez anymore, or they just cut in other road. And one of the roads which is more used for the moment is the Malian road throughout Gao and go to Algeria. What's happening in Agadez? So people are staying in ghetto, so they just are stuck in big houses, waiting for buses, cars, and they can stay there one day, but they can stay also there 2-3 weeks, and sometimes even months, because also they have to pay it. So if they don't have the means to pay to continue the journey, they are blocked there for several months. All the work that we done, Médecins du Monde, it's really to enter into those ghettos, negotiate with the chairman or who is responsible of the ghetto, and try to have medical screening and to have contact with that population.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I've been a bad moderator because I failed to introduce you, Stefan Heymans, who's the Director of Operations of MDM Belgium. Thanks very much for coming on board very much at the last minute. Unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't make it, so I think you're probably not in the program. So I think it's great that you could make it. Anke Reiffenstuel from the Humanitarian Affairs Department of the German Foreign Office. Listening to these statements and obviously following the situation attentively in West Africa on, as it were, the route to Libya, what are your observations? I mean, to an extent, from your perspective, are humanitarian actors actually delivering and doing what they should be doing in this kind of situation? And what can a big donor like Germany actually do here? Because after all, this is also a highly politicized environment where the EU and its member states, including Germany, pursue certain political objectives, for example, as mentioned, through partnership agreements with Niger. To what extent can you actually operate as a donor that wants to base itself on humanitarian principles in these situations?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction that you not just mentioned the Foreign Office, but also the Humanitarian Department, which is, I think, important to differentiate, because as we've seen over the past month and years, the debate on the migration somehow dominates the humanitarian situation that we are witnessing, and in these countries that is has many more aspects than just the migration issue. So for us, from our humanitarian perspective, it's very important to keep the humanitarian focus and to keep the whole picture, and always to make clear that there is that we find a very complex situation in the countries of origin and the countries that have been mentioned. For instance, if we speak of Niger, Niger of course is a transit country, but it is also a country that has IDPs, that has refugees of its own coming in relation to from the Boko Haram crisis of northeast Nigeria. We have famine there. It's a nutrition crisis. So there are pure acute humanitarian needs that need to be covered, apart from the needs that arise from the migration and transit movements we see. What we also have to take into account is that it's not only a humanitarian crisis or a humanitarian situation, but a very complex situation. So this is something that is a challenge for us, the humanitarians in the Foreign Office, that we need to take into account and that we need to address the humanitarian needs in these countries, but at the same time realizing that the situation is much more complex. It has development aspects, there are political aspects, it's a whole complexity of issues within the region that has traditionally been a very dynamic, a very high mobility region with migration traditions throughout the region. With very different reasons for migrating. So this is something which is a challenge because it forces us to stick to the humanitarian needs, to identify the humanitarian needs, and this is what brings us to not dictating what we probably find could be the right approach to address this whole complexity of issues, but to stay in close dialogue, in close exchange with the humanitarian agencies, with the humanitarian organizations, their needs assessments, their analysis of the situation, and their concept on what is necessary to address the very different, the specific needs. So when it comes to cooperating and to working in our structures, in our Foreign Office, what we do is to translate, to communicate the situation, the analysis, the recommendations, the perspective of the experts into the complexity of the situation that is being analyzed in our house. And then, of course, as Monica has mentioned before, and then funding the organizations and their work.
Before I turn to you, Mattia, I actually have a bit of a follow-up question for Monica or Stefan. To what extent do you come under political pressure to fundamentally stop people from crossing the Sahara and going on the way to Libya, and rather try and use your means to convince people to basically go back home?
You've decided that it was me, Hans. Thank you. Well, we are all under a very strong political pressure. We have, though, asked also at the EU, in Brussels, at the EU level, we have asked, we have advised that development aid should not be conditional to stopping the people, preventing the people coming. It should be conditional to the respect of human rights. And this is for us a very important point that we make all the time. The pressures that we find in terms of implementing are more that migration is something that has a very short sight, or it's short time frame. It's up to the next elections. So we are sort of prompted to implement quickly, and it's all it's very reactive rather than more proactive. And what we would like to see is some more stable funding, some more longer-term funding, some funding that can combine humanitarian interventions with stabilization, with resilience building, We are trying, for instance, in our response in Libya and in our plan of action, we're trying to combine protection measures, creating referral structures, open centers, trying to identify and hire women guards, etc., in distribution of non-food items, food in some cases, healthcare services in centers, with labor market needs assessment, trying to see what Libya is a country that heavily relies on migrants. And if it stops having migrants coming in, their whole economy is falling apart. So this is something that needs to be considered. And we need to have this aspect. And at times we are told, oh, but this is not emergency, this is not humanitarian. But it is important because some of the people that are in the detention centers might find their place in the labor market legally if there's places for them, and if we know that there's places for them. There have been some studies conducted by the World Bank, but nothing really local, at community level. Or support to IDPs, to local communities. Everything is done for the migrants and for the refugees, and the local communities displaced in their country, nothing is done for them. If you want to have the migrants accepted and integrated in the community, you need to also do something for the Libyans. Thank you.
It's a difficult issue. So the best scenario is not to have a governmental donor, but that's not the position of MDM. So because we couldn't afford it, so the idea is to choose the donor and to make sure that there is a donor only on humanitarian assistance, on healthcare, and not a mixture of, okay, we will give humanitarian assistance, but then after that you have also to inform about the risk of crossing the desert, and also that you know that they are not welcome in Europe. And those programs exist also. So we really have to enter into a negotiation, and I think that donor could also listen to have a comment. This is the red line. It's there was the former session was about negotiating with state. We negotiate with state, to cover humanitarian assistance program for this population.
Okay, let me see. Yes, it's working. Mattia, Toaldo, you work for the European Council on Foreign Relations based in London, and you look specifically at the European Union and its members and their political objectives and behavior in a way in these situations. So what would you be telling Stefan? What do you think he has to be looking at? What does he have to prepare himself for? Which direction is the political pressure likely to go?
Thank you very much. I must warn you that I will be very undiplomatic and anti-national in my in my reply. As you can hear from my accent, I'm Italian. So my warning to Stefan is to look at what's been happening in European and particularly in Italian policy on migration in Libya since January of this year. This is when a shift was made within Italian policy to stop a policy of indirectly accepting the flow of migrants, and actually the priority shifted more clearly towards stemming the flows at whatever cost. Between January and February, a deal was negotiated with the Libyan government. Negotiated is a euphemism, it was imposed on the Libyan government. And that deal doesn't mention international conventions, it doesn't mention the word refugees, it mentions several times clandestine immigration and clandestine immigrants. Of course, there is no mention of the word asylum. How could you think there is a mention of that word? Starting from then, there has been mostly an Italian policy in Libya with EU endorsement. There is then a separate EU policy, which we can discuss later, but a specific policy implemented by Italy in Libya, and particularly by the intelligence services and the Ministry of Interior. And this is a policy based basically on three elements. The third one you know very well, so I will start with the difficult part. The first element is deals with Libyan warlords who are in a very convenient position because they're at the same time the cops and the bad guys. They are at the same time members of the Coast Guard or the Ministry of Interior and the main smugglers. So you can strike a deal with them as Coast Guard and be sure that they will uphold the deal because they're also the smugglers. So it's one hand telling the other what to do. This deal was based on money. Probably it was for sure based on impunity. You do what we ask you and you will have impunity. And basically the effects of that deal were very evident in the middle of July when boats were literally stopped leaving from Libya. But then there is a second tier in case this deal doesn't work, and it has to do with the Libyan Coast Guard, which received a lot of help, 4 boats, and Italian ships in Libyan territorial waters, helping the Libyan Coast Guard to target, this is the right term, the migrant ships. And this increased enormously the amount of interceptions, let's call them for what they are, they're interceptions and arrests, they're not rescues, by the Libyan Coast Guard. This allows Italy to say that it doesn't do pushbacks, but we're effectively seeing pullbacks. So instead of Italy pushing them back, there is the Italy-supported Libyan Coast Guard which pulls them back to Libya. The end result is the same. They end up, when they're lucky, in detention centers, and when they're not lucky, in much worse places. And finally, there is the third element, which I suppose you know very well, which was to eliminate the factor that was rowing against the political priority of stemming the flows, and those were the NGOs. There was a convergence of interest between the Italian Ministry of Interior and the Libyan Coast Guard in eliminating the NGOs, which were third-party observers of what was happening, and which were actually taking people to the wrong side of the Mediterranean. And if you see the sequence of events, the famous or infamous code of conduct on NGOs was pushed forward exactly in the month in which the negotiations with the Libyan warlords were put in effect, in which the Libyan Coast Guard received decisive help. The result of this policy is that, of course, the conditions of migrants in Libya got worse. No one could think they could get worse, but they did. They now have no hope of escaping from Libya. Their best hope is to be freed upon payment of ransom and then move around in this terrible cycle. But there is no way out for them at the moment. But there is also a consequence on the Libyans of this migration policy and on the politics of intra-Libyan violence. The payment to Libyan warlords was like throwing bread into a fountain full of fishes, and all the fishes fight for that crumble of bread. In a conflict which is mostly about the predation of resources, we have created another resource for which different armed groups are fighting, and that resource is controlling the ports and the areas which are crucial for migration in order to gain leverage with Italy and with Europe, and therefore have immunity, weapons, and other elements. And in fact, the result was that since mid-September, there has been heavy fighting in the city of Sabrata. This was a part of Libya, which was, of course, was not paradise, but in which a series of local ceasefires had kept the level of violence extremely low in the last 2 years. Extremely low, of course, compared to the rest of the region, and not in absolute terms. But these local ceasefires had helped to save lots of lives. That balance has been broken now, and unfortunately, I'm afraid that we will see more fighting, more instability, and therefore more suffering both for Libyans and for migrants.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much also for moving us in a little way one step further towards Libya, and I want to kind of stay with that for a moment. Anke Reiffenstuel, Mattia has just described an environment that is marked by extreme levels of violence, conflict, tension inside Libya. At the same time, what we've all seen being in Europe also is that there's been not necessarily violence, but there's been extreme political controversy and debate and discussion, confrontation around the issue and around the issue of how to handle effectively people trying to flee across the Mediterranean. That's been, happening right here in Berlin, amongst other places. Apologies, but I have a little bit the same question for you as I had the first time round, which is that I'm just wondering, from your perspective as a donor, how can you, even as a donor, in this very politicized environment, kind of isolate yourself sufficiently from the political pressure and try and work in the way that you've tried to commit it to working to, bearing in mind that there are not many partners at the end of the day inside Libya that can work for understandable reasons because it's very dangerous.
Yes, it's difficult, and it's again a very complex situation. We have the situation within Libya, which is not just a migrant or refugee situation. We have a humanitarian situation in Libya with IDPs, with humanitarian emergency that needs to be addressed. At the same time, we have the situation on the Mediterranean Sea, and I sometimes have the impression that the public perception is focused on and the media coverage is focused on the situation that you've just mentioned, the Mediterranean Sea, the Coast Guard, the detention centers, also the approach that is being taken by the political side, by the governments, it's much more complex. It's not just focused on keeping these people away from Europe. It addresses the approach covers the situation in the countries of origin, the situation that I have mentioned before with the humanitarian needs that we are seeing in Niger, in the countries of transit. So there is a parallelity of several approaches and instruments that need to be used because the situation is very difficult and very complex. But for us as a humanitarian donor, it's important not to dictate what should be done from our perspective, but as I said, to speak with the humanitarian agencies that are on the ground. There are not so many in Libya. And to discuss what is the analysis, what are the needs, what needs to be covered, what are the priorities, and then fund the organization. Although, of course, I mentioned funding, but funding or the money is not the only problem, or probably not even the main problem in Libya. The main problem is the security and the access and the availability of organizations that are able to work on the ground. And even if you are present in Libya on the ground, then you might not be able to do the work in areas where you see the needs, be it in the detention centers or in general, because the situation, as we all know, in the detention centers is complicated, it's dramatic, it's horrible, but it's not that the organizations can go there and say, well, we do the job now. Libya is a country with a government that takes its own decision and that need to be respected. So it's always that the political side, the humanitarians, everyone has to work in a dialogue with the Libyan side. It's not that we decide what's right to do and then just do it. It's Libya is a very complicated issue, but still we need to respect that it has a government that is responsible for the situation and that needs to consider the instruments it takes and to decide on the steps that need to be taken to find solutions.
Thank you. We've talked about detention in Libya and what that does to people, the horrific effect it has on people. Monica, you mentioned earlier also the importance of human rights, and really that IOM highlights the importance of human rights in its contacts. And you're on the ground with IOM in Libya. So I'm interested in Libya as a protection crisis rather than using this broad blanket term humanitarian crisis. What realistically is there that an agency like IOM can actually do to try and enhance the protection of refugees and migrants in Libya who are exposed to this kind of violence?
Thank you. IOM is in Libya since 2006. Libya had joined the organization as a member state in 2004. And we have been there throughout, mostly with local staff. IOM as an organization has a ratio of 1 to 10 international and local staff. So we're about 9,000 and 90% of the staff is local staff. And this is something that allows us to remain in country when the UN has to leave. It's been the case in several countries. And so we are present in Libya with about 200 people, a mix between local staff, international staff from IOM on a rotation basis, because the access is on a rotation basis, on slots, and third-party contractors who are experts in the different fields, but not IOM staff proper. And we are working in the detention. We have access to all the 24 state-led detention centers, where we provide, as I say, non-food items, hygiene, sanitation. We're trying to identify now women guards that can be recruited and be put in the centers. We've tried to separate men and women. I mean, we are working there and are there to try to bring the assistance to the people while they're there, while advocating for alternatives to detention. We're in discussion with the government on the opening of open centers. We do that together with UNHCR. We are working as part of the interagency initiative to build a referral mechanism between to be able to refer the vulnerable cases, to be able to, at disembarkation, for instance, bring the vulnerable people, the children, etc., to specific places. We are working to establish appropriate identification and coordination mechanisms, provide capacity building and training, including to the Libyan Coast Guard, and work closely with the Ministry of Social Affairs and other ministries. We are convinced, and this in general, that migration requires a whole-of-government approach. That is, different entities have different roles to play, and they need to sit together and to understand that they have a role. And we don't do that only in Europe, but we do it also in the countries we work in, and we try to do that also in Libya.
Thanks very much. Before turning to Tunisia and Morocco, which I think is important, I do have one more question on Libya to Mattia, actually. We've heard a couple of times now about the Libyan government and working with the Libyan government, but then on the other hand, what we read in the media is, well, there's no such thing, or there's several, and nobody seems to really know how much ground they actually control and who necessarily makes them up. I mean, for a humanitarian organization, is there someone to work with in Libya in terms of a government?
Mm-hmm. That's the $1 million question. Yeah, the Libyan government, recognized by the international community, is not a strong government. It's probably not even a government. You often read in the media about a presidency council. Now a council should be made up of at least 2 people. But effectively, the presidency council, which originally was made up of 9, then went down to 7, then to 5, then to 3, and now to 1. So they've lost the minimum requirement to be a council. Who are the people really in charge? Well, those mix between bad guys and cops that I was mentioning before, people who have both a role in the informal sector and in the government structure, who at the same time are the Department for Combating Illegal Immigration and those organizing illegal immigration. So either very schizophrenic people or people who have understood what's the step forward in organized crime, which is the direct control of the state. So there is a Libyan state to deal with. And I think we've given this Libyan state the wrong incentives. Of course, if you tell them your main goal is to stem the flows, they'll do it the way they know how to do it, by whipping the migrants on the ships, for instance, or by keeping or locking them up in detention centers. If you never ask them to ratify the Geneva Convention, they will not do that by themselves. There is no spontaneous movement towards that ratification. And I think one important challenge now is the attempt to which Monica was referring to, go beyond detention of migrants. And again, this is something that the EU, and specifically Italy, has pushed for. Libya had a relatively liberal policy on migration, even too liberal, according to many Libyans, because Gaddafi used to give free visas to Africans. Then under Italian pressure in 2010, a law was approved, modeled on the Italian law, which criminalized irregular migration, and the result was the creation of detention centers. Now pushing the Libyan government, according to the definition I was giving before, to open those detention centers and move towards reception centers, I think that's one thing that we should push the EU to do. And I think the efforts to create an open structure in Libya should be supported, efforts by the UNHCR. The Libyan government is clearly, the formal one, the Council of One, is obstructing the creation of that single camp for 1,000 people. Even just one single camp for 1,000 people is a huge threat to the real government. If you eliminate detention, you eliminate their main source of revenue, both as government actors and as smugglers.
Thank you. Now, we've talked a fair bit about Libya, and we don't talk very much necessarily about Morocco and Tunisia. And I'm not even going to ask you to compare, Stefan, but perhaps rather just to tell us a little bit about the main challenges that refugees and migrants face in those countries, and the main challenges you face in your attempts to try and support them.
Yeah, it's true. It's in this migrant crisis, or the political crisis, Libya takes a big part of it. But the three countries, in fact, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Let's start about Tunisia. So Tunisia, I think it's one of more or less success of the Arab Spring. It's a state really who is building himself, and for the moment they are making the protection mechanism, asylum seeking law, etc., which is a very interesting moment to be there, so to try to influence the government. The situation in Tunisia are much more or sub-Saharan Africa, but who were coming as a student and then they stay in Tunisia, or there is also Libyan migrants fleeing the insecurity, fleeing also the lack of state and the lack of economical way of survive in Libya. So there is a lot of Libyan living now in Tunisia. There is a kind of an agreement between Libya and Tunisia, so they are legal to stay. And we are tackling a lot of problem of access to health from Libyan, because of course they were rich, but if they remain 5 to 6 years in Tunisia, they get poor and poor, and they increase their vulnerability. So now a big part of our patients are Libyan patients living in Tunis or in other cities. Morocco, it's another story. Morocco is along the road, so if you go see again the maps, you go to Agadez, Arlit, you cross Algeria, and then after that you cross to Morocco to go to the Melilla and Ceuta, or to cross to Spain. We have noticed a little increase since the blockage of boats in Libya in Morocco. So there is a little increase of people using that road. Morocco also, it's a special moment. Also, it's a state who is building also his law about protection, asylum law, a new office for refugees, etc. They have also started a big regularization campaign in 2014, and that's important to say that we can also have other politics than just don't want migrants. You can also regularize them. And that's what Morocco did in 2014, and they want to do a second phase apparently in 2017. There is 50,000 estimation migrants in Morocco or in big city or in the forest around Nador and Oujda, which is close to the Algerian border or close to the Ceuta and Melilla. The most difficult things with Morocco is to access to the people. Two different elements in the forest. Policemen are everywhere, very difficult to access, a very violent context. One of the manner to control the let's say, those illegal camp, it's to displace people inside the country, so they take some people and they put in the south, in the center, etc. The other setup, it's into urban area, and there it's very complex because it's very controlled by chairmen, by human trafficker, and we are in the same negotiation that probably in Libya. It's how to access to enter into a home, apartment, to have access to that population.
Thank you very much. And now I want to open the floor up to you. And to your questions. And again, I would just ask you to perhaps briefly say who you are, and then if the question is directed to a particular panelist, let us know that too. And if we can keep the questions relatively short, we will have more time for the answers, which would be interesting too. So let me have a look around. I'm just going to do some scanning. Okay, there's a question here in the front. Would you, somebody with a microphone coming exactly here. And we perhaps just collect a couple first. Let's see.
Thank you very much. I would like to add one point more to this debate about people who have come through to Europe and are now asylum seekers or refugees in Europe or in Germany. What is made to make them return? And this is a very interest of many member states of the EU, especially of Germany, how to make them return. And that's why I direct my question to Mrs. Goracci. The IOM is now a UN-like organization, very focused on humanitarian field. And one basic point of your organization's work is voluntary return of refugees and asylum seekers to their home countries. And you get quite good funds from the Interior Ministry of Germany, perhaps from other ministries also. And the return is, as I got the information, is not only to peaceful countries, it is also to countries which are worn by conflict, are violent, and there's no protection for the people who return. I asked you because I have no information about the countries in Africa, because it's recently, but you have succeeded to make return voluntarily to Afghanistan last year, 7,000 people, and from Germany only more than 3,000 people. How you manage this?
Afghanistan is should really be the subject of a separate panel.
No,
so
sorry,
I think
sorry.
The question is maybe clear, and if we can focus it on North Africa.
Let me finish, please. That is only the example how you succeeded to make return people to Afghanistan voluntarily, and how you would like to apply this also in these new countries in Africa, which are in a similar situation.
Thanks. There's a gentleman here, just a little bit further, the glasses.
Thank you very much. There was a reference, I think it was brought by Anke, that Niger, Libya, these are all countries of transport, and that the migrants are mainly coming from, there was a reference to countries of origin. My question is, are there any statistics of where these migrants are coming from Africa? Because somehow we seem to have the idea that they are coming all from one place, but in fact they are not. They're coming from multiple countries in Africa. And part, I think, if we are considering this a problem, part of solving the problem is finding the source of the problem and finding a solution for it. Also there was another reference to trying to change those detention centers into reception centers. And so once the normal listener listens to this, we can't help but thinking there is an effort to keep those people there. So even if we say we are not trying to do this, we are trying to do this. We are trying to keep them there by improving their conditions of being in these countries. So what are the measures we are taking actually to improve the situation in their countries of origin in order to prevent this from happening? Because for people who are willing to drink their own piss and get raped on the way, you can't tell me that this is happening only because they want to find a better job or they are doing it for the money. No, the conditions in their countries are much worse than that they are facing in these roads, and this is why they are moving in the first place. So are we doing enough in their countries of origin in order to prevent this in the first place? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll start with those two questions. Monica, would you like to tackle the return question first?
Do I have to? I guess I have. Okay. IOM, as you know, runs the assisted voluntary return in Germany since '79 on behalf of the German government. As it's a very complex return program because it is carried out in all the Länder, and as opposite to what we do in other countries, we do not do counseling here. Counseling for return is not done by IOM. It's done by Beratungsstellen and by it's state-led and NGOs, etc. We have just one counseling center here in Brandenburg and in Berlin. And you would be surprised to know how many people come to us because they want to return. We don't do outreach. They know us because the Behörden know that we are doing it and they refer to us. But there are a lot of people, and now they come also to our office that is not doing counseling in Mitte to ask for return. So we don't do anything to convince them to return. The program foresees reintegration packages according to the countries that they go to. We are trying to promote reintegration in kind and to link it to community reintegration and reintegration support for the communities they return to, because that is also another issue. When migrants return with money, at times it's extorted from them. So we're trying to see if it's not possible to give reintegration support for housing, for instance, or something that is more longer term. And that is something that we are negotiating with the government and we are discussing also at EU level, because it's not something that is deemed important, but it is fundamental if you want to make return sustainable.
Thank you. Anke Reiffenstuel, do you want to talk about countries of origin, and then maybe Stefan afterwards as well?
When it comes to the countries of origin, it's mainly the countries that are not the humanitarian hub, so to say. It's mainly West Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Nigeria, but Senegal, but also Bangladesh. So this is already implies the answer to what should be done. So it's not humanitarian programs that need to be done. Maybe in individual cases there are needs, but it's development and other instruments that need to be applied: crisis prevention, governance building, good governance, education issues that education that needs to be provided. The labor market that needs to be extended and reformed, and so counseling in many of these fields are necessary. And this again is not a short-term issue. I mean, the migration, the migrant, the decision to migrate or to leave home towards Europe or at least towards Libya, it's always an individual decision. So there is, I think, a whole range of reasons for leaving your country of origin. But the issues that need to be addressed in the countries of origin are mainly in development-related areas, and that are, of course, long-term challenges.
Just a few points, for example, in about returning and expulsion and forced expulsion. For the moment, just last week, Algeria has expelled more than 1,000 people in Niger, in Agadez. So what they do, they just take the people, put in a truck, cross the border, land the people there and say, okay, government of Niger, so you can handle that. IOM, you can pay the flight tickets to the other country. So it's not only Europe. It's like really a ping pong game between the country, between Morocco and Algeria. It's open quite often also to take the people, go in Algeria, and then the other way around. It's happened also in Europe, Belgium, France, with transit migrants. The policemen take migrants, put in the other side of the border. I think it's really a trend. It's the level of violence that our society in Europe, but also everywhere, we accepted towards this population. And there is a very rapid trend on we accept more and more violence. Just to control the flow, which is, I'm sorry, but that's an illusion, which will be not controllable.
Thank you. Monica, I think you wanted to add something?
No, I was just thinking when Anke was speaking that according to our statistics on the interviews that we carry out in the detention centers, 80% of those who are there actually come to Libya. Their intention is to stay in Libya and to find work in Libya. So it's not to cross.
Okay, thank you. I can sense that you want to say something. I do want to take some more questions, but it's not fair. So I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, just a point on the countries of origin issue. Because I think, of course, part of the answer is development aid, for sure. But some of the people who come to Europe are fleeing, for instance, climate change. And that will not be solved solely by development aid. Of course, development aid has a huge role to play in containing the effects of climate change. But the main source is climate change, which we have to address. Others, for instance, are fleeing land grabbing, which in most cases is done by European companies. So I sometimes say in discussions in cafes, if you don't want them to come here, we should stop going there too much. And that when our companies go there and do land grabbing and then the people come here because they don't have land anymore, we shouldn't complain. So there are things we can do in the countries of origin, but don't think that there is an alternative between doing things in the countries of origin and letting them come here. That is the worst service we can do to the development aid community, to say that if you want to stem the flows, you have to invest more in development aid. We need to invest in development aid because we need to, and because it's fair, and because we want to have partners on the other side, not because we want to stop them from coming.
No, but what I wanted to say is if we don't invest in development aid, in the stabilization of the countries, in the political stability, then then I mean this is the starting point. If you don't do that, then you don't even take any other measures. It won't lead anywhere.
There's a lot of willingness to debate on the panel, but I do actually want to get another couple of questions in, if I may. So you'll get your shot. So there's a gentleman top right who goes to the same hairdresser as me. And if you could perhaps raise your hand again, then there we go. So the mic's on the way, right? So raise your arm again, sir, so that they can see where to give the mic. Thanks.
Rainer Dörflinger, MSF Austria. I just want to have a question around this detention center. We use this term of detention center as a sort of some legal reference. My question would be, what is the real legal behind of this detention center? Are they acting on any legal requirements or laws? because it's seemingly a Libyan speciality, because we don't talk about detention center in Morocco, we don't talk about detention center in Egypt, for example, for migrants, because they're just used in normal prison. So what is the difference of this detention center on the legal issue? Is there something to differentiate? Is there just an arbitrary detention, like a slave market, or should we access it in a different way? I think we use it already, detention center is a term we're really flying away, so maybe we can have some clearance about it. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And we have a question very far there on the left, light blue t-shirt. So, if you stand up, then our colleagues with the microphone will be able to spot you. They're on their way. And it's a long way.
Hello, my name is Theresa Leisgang. I'm here for Sea-Watch, and I thank you very much for this interesting panel. So I have to admit that I'm a little bit frustrated with the answers that were given concerning the relationships between, for instance, Germany and the Libyan governments, because the question was very precise. How can Germany negotiate or do deals with a government that is not a government? We have just heard that on the panel. And I mean, when I was on mission in the Mediterranean, I have seen how the Libyan coast guards act. I was there when they almost crashed our ship. So clearly, they do whatever they want to do, and they don't necessarily do what Germany tells them to, even if we fund them with $200 million or euros. So my question is, well, it would be the same question again. Will Germany go on doing deals like that with Libya or Chad or Niger?
Thank you. And then take one more on this side too, Martin. We do have a thing for the same haircut in this particular round of questions.
Thank you, Martin Quack, independent consultant. I would just like to add on the two last questions that I remember that in the beginning of the year, the situation in those camps called detention camps was compared to the situation in concentration camps by German diplomats, which is something unheard of, and diplomats from this country would be extremely cautious to use such kind of words. Just to add to those two questions that we just got.
Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions about the detention system in Libya. Mattia, I let you start with that, maybe?
So, well, first of all, Libya is not the only country, unfortunately, that detains migrants and refugees. But the detention has legal foundations. I was mentioning before the law that Libya approved under Gaddafi in 2010 and under European pressure, which criminalizes irregular migration. Without that law, there would be no legal grounds for that detention. Of course, a law approved in 2010 matters only up to a certain point, given the current situation. But asking the Libyan government to remove that law, or at least suspend the implementation of that law, would be a first step, because it would eliminate at least the legal fig leaf to that detention. Then, of course, those, I call them detention centers out of a convention, but the real name should be kidnapping centers. They are part of that system in which there is osmosis between, let's call it osmosis, between smugglers and the Coast Guard and the Ministry of Interior, so that people who are brought there are usually the people who paid the wrong smuggler, the one that is not part of this osmosis, and they're brought to the detention center, freed only upon payment of ransom. Then they have to pay again the right smuggler, and then maybe they will let go to Europe. So it's something illegal which has some legal grounds according to Libyan legislation.
Okay, as we're coming up to the end of the session, I will use these three questions, and your answers to them a little bit as a final round as well, because we do have to stop on time. So, Monica, do you want to say something about detention in Libya, which is obviously a context where IOM is active?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that administrative detention for migrants in irregular situation exists in Europe as well. There's many countries who have detention centers for migrants for administrative purposes. So it's not something now, the nature of the Libyan ones was clearly explained, but it's something that exists. And in Libya, they were there before already. We went with a delegation in 2004 when they became members, and we visited 2 of these detention centers in Tripoli. One was an open center where the migrants were waiting for their documentations, and it was sort of the assisted voluntary return center where the diplomats were going to issue the travel documents, and another one was a closed detention center, and the conditions were pretty bad then too.
And if I may add, the so-called detention centers, it's the reality on the ground, and we cannot ignore it. What we are aiming at, what UNHCR and IOM are aiming at, is to improve the situation there, and at the same time working towards establishing alternatives, open alternatives, reception centers, reception facilities, even if so far we are on the way towards one of them with a limited number of places that might be that could be accepted in the center. But it's not black or white. It's the several approaches you have to take in parallel, and you have to follow to somehow improve the situation for those in the centers. So we cannot just ignore that there are these centers with these horrible conditions, but somehow have to work towards improving the conditions in these centers, and at the same time working towards alternatives. And when speaking of the Coast Guard, I mean, the Libyan Coast Guard is an authority as such, and the assistance that goes towards this Libyan Coast Guard is to training, to courses, training also in human rights, in international law, to regulations and standards, which is again something that must be seen as a process that will take some time. But we think that this is the only way to somehow continue the dialogue to come to a improvement of the situation.
Stefan, I want to ask you to close our panel. Can you tell us a little bit about how the state authorities generally, tell us a little bit more, I should say, about how the state authorities in, for example, Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia are actually treating migrants and refugees. You've already mentioned, for example, the situation in the forests around the 2 Spanish enclaves. How does that in any way compare to what we're hearing from and seeing in Libya?
No, I will not compare, because it's a level of violence which is not imaginable in Libya. And when you look at all testimony that people coming from Libya, it's really a nightmare. But the state violence is one of the major actor of violence towards migrants on the journey. And I will just go back to Niger. Niger is the good student of European Union because they make a law on human trafficking. And so, for the moment, what's happened exactly is that the migration just disappeared. We could not find the people. They are hidden. The human trafficker also closed their door to the ghetto. And so those kind of law create more difficult access to the population. And that's really an issue that you can see in several countries. When you create law, you have also to create law to protect people and not only towards the human trafficker.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we will have to end here, but I'm going to close, if I may, just with another quote from provided by this Italian NGO I mentioned in the beginning, and this one is attributed to 3 people, A, and K, from Somalia and Ethiopia, and it's about Libya. They kept us locked up in a cellar with no light for 11 months. Our abductors would enter the cell daily with their faces covered to beat us using a metal pole with a nail fixed on one end. They would give us barely any food or water. The torturing became more violent in the times they would hand us a phone to call our families. We saw more than 50 people die. And this is from an interview conducted in Sicily in August 2017. And I think there's really nothing further to add except to thank our speakers and ask for a round of applause for them.